November 21st, 1963, Washington, D.C. Bill Hartley watched President Kennedy refuse Edgar Hoover's outstretched hand. The FBI director's face went white. In that moment, Bill knew they were all dead men. What Kennedy had just said to Hoover would have toppled the government. 5 words that made the most powerful man in America tremble. Bill was the only witness to those words, the only one who knew what really broke the handshake protocol that shocked every reporter in City Hall. 48 hours later, Dallas happened. For 60 years, Bill kept Kennedy's secret. He buried the truth so deep he almost believed the official story himself. Almost. The night before his assassination, Kennedy had discovered something that made him refuse to touch J. Edgar Hoover ever again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Georgetown, November 2023. The photograph slid across Bill Hartley's mahogany counter like a death sentence. His weathered hands, steady despite his 72 years, trembled as they hovered over the black and white image. There he was, young, lean, standing 3 feet behind President Kennedy's left shoulder in that cramped anteroom off the Oval Office. The photo captured the exact moment JFK had spoken those 5 words that changed everything. "You recognize yourself, Mr. Hartley?" The woman's voice cut through the musty silence of his bookstore like surgical steel. She couldn't have been more than 30, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter storms. Her coat was expensive Burberry. Maybe, but she wore it like armor. Bill's throat constricted. In 60 years, no photograph of that meeting had ever surfaced. The official records listed only Kennedy and Hoover present. Bill's presence had been scrubbed from every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that the meeting had occurred. "Where did you get this?" His voice came out as a whisper. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The same place I got these." 3 more photographs fanned across the counter, Kennedy's face contorting with rage, Hoover stepping backward, his hand still extended in that futile handshake, and in the final shot Bill's own face, pale with horror as he realized what Kennedy had just set in motion. The bell above his shop door chimed as an elderly customer shuffled in, seeking refuge from the November rain. Bill forced his expression neutral, sliding the photographs into a drawer with practiced calm. 60 years of keeping secrets had taught him to compartmentalize terror. "We'll be closing in 5 minutes, Mrs. Patterson," he called to the regular customer browsing his rare biography section. His voice betrayed nothing of the earthquake happening inside his chest. The woman across from him, she hadn't given her name, waited with predatory patience. She understood the game. She knew he couldn't run, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but play along until they were alone again. Mrs. Patterson selected a worn copy of Schlesinger's 1,000 Days and shuffled to the counter. As Bill rang up the sale, his mind raced through possibilities. CIA, NSA, or something worse, something connected to the shadow network that had orchestrated everything that followed Dallas. The transaction felt eternal. Small talk about Kennedy biographies while photographs of his darkest secret lay inches from his fingertips. When Mrs. Patterson finally disappeared into the Georgetown rain, Bill locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. "My name is Claire Novak," the woman said, as if 60 years of silence could be broken with simple introductions. "I represent certain interests that have recently acquired materials from a private collection, materials that paint a rather different picture of November 1963. Bill's legs felt weak. He gripped the counter's edge, feeling every one of his 72 years. "What do you want?" "The truth, Mr. Hartley. You were chief of staff for exactly 11 more months after Kennedy's death. Then you vanished from politics entirely, bought this little shop, lived quietly, never married, estranged from your only daughter." She paused, letting the threat sink in. "Sarah's doing well at the Post, by the way. Investigative journalism runs in the family, apparently." The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow. His daughter brilliant, stubborn, with her mother's fierce sense of justice and his own dangerous curiosity. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since their last bitter argument about his wasted life hiding among dusty books instead of using his knowledge to serve the country. If only she knew what his knowledge would cost them both. "Sarah doesn't know anything," he said quickly. "Perhaps not yet." Claire's smile sharpened. "But these photographs are just the beginning. There are recordings, Mr. Hartley, audio files that capture every word spoken in that room, including Kennedy's accusation, including Hoover's response, including your promise to fix the problem." The world tilted. Bill gripped the counter harder, fighting the urge to collapse. He'd spent 6 decades believing that secret had died with both men, that his own role in the tragedy that followed was buried so deep it would never surface. "The files are scheduled for release in 72 hours, Claire continued. "Unless, of course, we reach an understanding." Outside, Georgetown's tree-lined streets sparkled with early holiday lights, peaceful and ordinary. Inside the bookstore that had been his sanctuary for 4 decades, Bill Hartley felt the walls of his carefully constructed life crumbling around him. Those 5 words Kennedy had spoken to Hoover, the choice Bill had made to protect the presidency, the phone call he'd made that sealed Kennedy's fate. It was all about to come out. And this time, there would be nowhere to hide. "What understanding?" he asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want the answer. Claire reached into her coat and withdrew a slim digital recorder, no larger than a pack of cigarettes. The device looked alien among his leather-bound volumes and brass fixtures. "November 22nd, 1963, 11:47 a.m., approximately 90 minutes before the motorcade departed Love Field." She pressed play. Static crackled, then voices emerged from 6 decades past. First Hoover's familiar baritone, measured and bureaucratic. "Mr. President, I believe we need to discuss certain rumors that have reached my attention." Bill's finger shot out and jabbed the stop button. The sudden silence felt like a gunshot. "Where?" The word came out strangled. "Where did you find this? Does it matter?" Claire's gray eyes studied him with clinical interest. "What matters is that it exists, that it's real, and that it will destroy not just your legacy, but Sarah's life when the world learns what her father did." The mention of his daughter again sent ice through his veins. Sarah, his brilliant, relentless daughter who'd inherited every stubborn gene from both her parents. She was supposed to be covering a city council meeting right now, chasing down corruption in municipal contracts, fighting the same fights for truth that had driven her mother. Clean fights, honorable fights. Not the kind of moral quicksand that had swallowed her father whole. Bill moved away from the counter, his legs unsteady. He found himself among the presidential biographies, surrounded by the sanitized stories of great men. His fingers brushed the spine of Manchester's Death of a President. How many times had he read that account, searching between the lines for any hint that the truth might surface? "I tried to save him," he whispered. "I know." Claire's voice followed him through the narrow aisles. "The recording makes that clear. Kennedy accused Hoover of covering up evidence of Soviet contacts within the administration. Hoover threatened to release files that would destroy the presidency. And you," she paused, "you promised to handle the situation, to find a solution that protected both men." The bookstore felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Bill's chest tightened as memories flooded back unbidden, the frantic phone calls in the hours after that meeting, the careful negotiations with men whose names still couldn't be spoken aloud, the terrible mathematics of choosing between exposures, which secrets could be buried, which scandals could be weathered, which sacrifices were necessary to preserve the office itself. "I was protecting the country," he said, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "Were you? Or were you protecting yourself?" The question hit like a physical blow. Bill turned to face her, seeing his own reflection ghosted in the darkened window behind her, an old man who'd spent 60 years telling himself he'd made the only choice possible. "The motorcade route through Dealey Plaza," Claire continued relentlessly. "That wasn't the Secret Service's first choice, was it? The original route would have taken Kennedy straight to the Trade Mart. Minimal exposure, maximum security. Stop." 72 hours, he repeated numbly. Claire slipped the recorder back into her coat. "My employers will be in touch with specific instructions. Until then, I suggest you maintain your normal routine. Continue running your charming little bookstore. Don't contact your daughter. Don't attempt to leave the city." Her smile never wavered. "Don't make the same mistake twice, Mr. Hartley." The bell chimed as she opened the door, Georgetown's autumn air rushing in to mix with the musty scent of old paper and older secrets. Bill watched her disappear into the lamplight, her footsteps clicking against wet pavement until the night swallowed her completely. He locked the door with trembling hands, then stood motionless in his sanctuary-turned-prison. The presidential biographies seemed to mock him from their shelves, all those sanitized stories of great men making noble sacrifices. None of them told the truth about the choices that happened in the shadows. The phone calls that rerouted motorcades, the terrible arithmetic of trading one life for the stability of a nation. Bill moved through his evening routine like a sleepwalker. Cash register closed, lights dimmed, security system armed. But when he climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment above the shop, muscle memory failed him. He stood frozen at the threshold, staring at 40 years of carefully constructed solitude. The apartment was modest, a testament to the quiet life he'd chosen after abandoning power's corridors. But tonight, familiar objects felt foreign. The reading chair where he'd spent countless evenings with Lincoln biographies and bourbon. The kitchen table where he ate solitary meals while reading newspapers that never quite told the whole truth. The bedroom where he'd lain awake for decades, calculating the cost of his silence. His phone sat on the kitchen counter like an accusation. Don't contact your daughter. Sarah's number was still programmed into the old rotary phone, though he hadn't dialed it in 3 years. Their last conversation echoed in his memory, her voice sharp with frustration and disappointment as she accused him of wasting his knowledge, of hiding from history instead of helping others learn from it. You could have written books, Dad, memoirs. You knew Kennedy personally, worked in the inner circle during the most turbulent presidency of the century. Instead, you hide behind other people's words, selling stories instead of telling your own. If only she understood. If only he could explain that some stories were too dangerous to tell, that some truths carried prices too terrible to pay. Bill's hands moved without conscious thought, lifting the phone's heavy receiver. Sarah's number came to his fingers, automatically muscle memory from a time when they'd spoken every Sunday evening, when she'd been his anchor to the world beyond these walls. But as the first digit rotated home, another sound cut through the apartment's silence. Footsteps. Deliberate and measured, moving across the bookstore below. Bill's blood turned to ice. The security system hadn't chimed. No one should have been able to enter without triggering the sensors he'd installed 5 years ago, sensors that had seemed like paranoid overkill until tonight. He replaced the receiver with exaggerated care, straining to listen. The footsteps moved with purpose, someone who knew exactly where they were going. Not a burglar rifling through the cash register, not a vagrant seeking shelter. Someone conducting a methodical search. Moving to his bedroom window, Bill peered down at the street. A black sedan idled across from his shop, its engine running, windows tinted dark enough to hide its occupants. As he watched, a second figure emerged from the alley behind his building, speaking quietly into a radio before disappearing into the shadows. Professional surveillance, the kind he remembered from his White House days, when Secret Service details moved with identical precision around presidential motorcades. Bill backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. Claire's warning echoed in his mind, don't make the same mistake twice. But what mistake? Trusting the wrong people? Making deals with shadows? Or something else entirely, something that had gotten John Kennedy killed and left Bill carrying the weight of that choice for 60 years? The footsteps below had stopped. In the suffocating quiet, Bill heard the soft beep of his security system being disarmed from the inside. Someone else had the codes. His sanctuary was compromised. His carefully constructed life was crumbling. And somewhere in Washington, Sarah was investigating stories that might lead her straight into the same darkness that had consumed her father. Bill Hartley realized with crystal clarity that 72 hours might be 71 hours too many. The past had finally come home. This isn't happening, he told himself, even as footsteps resumed their measured pace below. This is paranoia. 60 years of guilt finally driving you insane. But the black sedan across the street was real. The voices murmuring into radios were real, and somewhere in his bookstore, someone moved with the confidence of complete familiarity. Bill's hands shook as he reached for his phone again, but not to call Sarah. Marcus Webb's number came from deeper memory, a contact he'd prayed never to use again. His old deputy from the White House Communications Office, the only other person who knew about the calls made in those frantic hours after Kennedy's confrontation with Hoover. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a gravelly voice answered. Jesus Christ, Bill. Not hello, not surprise at hearing from him after 15 years. Just immediate bone-deep fear. Tell me you're calling about your daughter's articles. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Bill's knees buckled and he sank onto his bed. How do you hang up? Marcus's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Hang up right now and get out of there. The line went dead. Bill stared at the phone, his mind reeling. Marcus knew about Sarah's investigation, which meant others knew, which meant the network that Claire represented had been watching, planning, positioning pieces on a chessboard that Bill had foolishly believed was packed away with other Cold War relics. A soft creak from the stairwell leading to his apartment froze his blood. They were coming up. Bill moved with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd spent decades preparing for this moment without admitting it to himself. The emergency bag hidden behind his bedroom radiator contained cash, fake identification papers that had cost him a fortune in the 1970s, an A-38 revolver he'd never hoped to use. Old habits from an era when trust was a luxury no one could afford. The footsteps on the stairs were deliberate, unhurried, professional. Bill slipped out his apartment's back door onto the fire escape, his breath forming clouds in the November air. Georgetown stretched below him, all warmth and light and civilized comfort. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the weight of history that was about to crush him. His feet found the metal rungs automatically, muscle memory from emergency drills that had seemed like game playing 60 years ago. The alley behind his building was dark, filled with dumpsters and the detritus of urban life. He'd used this exit exactly 3 times in 40 years, always wondering if paranoia was eating him alive. Tonight, he understood that paranoia had kept him alive. Bill emerged from the alley onto a side street, forcing himself to walk normally despite every instinct screaming at him to run. Behind him, lights flickered on in his apartment windows. They would find it empty, would realize he'd slipped away, would begin the hunt in earnest. But where could he go? His entire life for 4 decades had been contained within 6 city blocks. He knew every shopkeeper, every regular customer, every safe haven in Georgetown, all of which made him predictable, all of which made him vulnerable. His phone buzzed. Text message from a number he didn't recognize. Your daughter is working late tonight. Post newsroom, 15th floor. Would hate for her investigation to take an unfortunate turn. Return home, Mr. Hartley. Let's discuss this like civilized people. Bill's vision blurred. They had Sarah under surveillance, were threatening her because of stories she was writing, research she was conducting into the same shadows that had swallowed him whole. He turned back toward his building, then stopped. Across the street, 2 figures in dark coats stood beside the black sedan, their attention focused on his bookstore, waiting for him to return, confident in their leverage. They understood him perfectly, knew that threats to Sarah would override every survival instinct, every lesson learned from 60 years of keeping secrets. Knew that he would sacrifice himself to protect the daughter he'd kept at arm's length precisely to shield her from this moment. Bill Hartley stood in the Georgetown shadows, feeling the full weight of choices made in 1963 finally coming home to claim their price. In his pocket, the emergency cash felt pathetic. The fake identification felt antiquated. The gun felt like a relic from a war that had never really ended. Above him, his apartment lights continued burning. Below him, the street waited with patient malevolence. And somewhere across the city, Sarah worked late into the night, chasing stories that would destroy them both. The text message burned in Bill's vision like an afterimage. Your daughter is working late tonight. Each word was a carefully placed blade, designed to cut through 60 years of protective distance and leave him bleeding in a Georgetown alley. He forced himself to breathe, to think beyond the animal panic clawing at his chest. Sarah was 15 floors above the street, surrounded by colleagues and security, investigating stories that seemed unconnected to the shadows now closing around them both. But Bill knew better than most how quickly safety could evaporate, how easily accidents could be arranged. The emergency cash in his pocket felt worthless now. What good was escape money when running meant abandoning his daughter to consequences he'd spent her entire life trying to prevent? His phone buzzed again. This time, a voice call from the unknown number. Mr. Hartley. Claire's voice carried easily through the night air, calm and professional. I trust you received our message. If you touch her, we won't need to. Sarah is quite capable of destroying herself without our intervention. Do you know what story she's been researching these past 3 weeks? Bill's throat constricted. He'd stopped following Sarah's career closely years ago. The guilt of separation easier to bear than the constant fear that she might stumble onto something that would connect back to him. Municipal corruption, city contracts. Claire's laugh held genuine amusement. Oh, Mr. Hartley, your daughter inherited more of your investigative instincts than you realize. She's been tracking a series of defense contracts awarded in the 1960s. Payments made to private security firms for consultation services during presidential visits to Dallas, Memphis, Los Angeles. Fascinating pattern work, really. The kind of deep research that might uncover certain off-the-books operations. The alley walls seemed to close in around him. Sarah wasn't chasing random municipal corruption. She was following financial breadcrumbs that led straight back to November 1963. to the network of contractors and consultants who'd provided plausible deniability for operations that officially never existed. "She doesn't know," Bill whispered. "She has no idea what she's looking for." "Not yet, but your daughter is remarkably tenacious. Given enough time, she'll connect the dots." Payments made to the same firm that provided security consultation for the Dallas motorcade route. Communications intercepts that somehow never made it into the Warren Commission report. And eventually, inevitably, she'll find the recordings. Bill's legs gave out. He slumped against a brick wall, the rough surface scraping through his jacket. There were more recordings, more evidence of that terrible November day when he'd been forced to choose between exposing a conspiracy or becoming part of a larger one. How many? The question came out strangled. Does it matter? What matters is that your daughter is 3 interviews away from uncovering her father's role in the assassination of a president. Imagine the headlines, Mr. Hartley. Imagine how that revelation will destroy not just her career, but her entire understanding of the man who raised her. Through the alley's mouth, Bill could see his bookstore windows glowing warmly in the night. 40 years of careful anonymity, of choosing dusty academia over the corridors of power, of building walls between himself and the world to protect everyone he'd ever loved. All of it crumbling because he'd been naive enough to believe that time could bury truth. "What do you want me to do?" he asked again, though part of him already knew. "Return home. Let's have a proper conversation about Sarah's research and how it might be redirected toward safer subjects. Municipal corruption is so much cleaner than presidential assassination, don't you think?" But Bill was already moving, walking back toward his building with the mechanical precision of a man who'd run out of choices. The figures beside the black sedan straightened as he approached, their body language shifting from patient surveillance to active engagement. He understood now why Claire had seemed so confident in the bookstore, why she'd given him 72 hours instead of demanding immediate compliance. She'd known that threatening Sarah would accomplish in minutes what hours of negotiation couldn't achieve. As he crossed the street toward his compromised sanctuary, Bill's mind raced through the arithmetic of sacrifice. His own life had been forfeit since 1963, every day since Dallas had been borrowed time. But Sarah was innocent. Sarah was brilliant and stubborn and utterly unprepared for the kind of moral quicksand that had swallowed her father's generation. The bookstore's front door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk like an invitation. Bill paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the brass handle he'd polished every morning for 4 decades. Inside, shadows moved between the shelves, waiting for him to complete the terrible circle that had begun with a handshake refused and a president's accusations, waiting for him to make another impossible choice between truth and survival. Bill Hartley stepped inside, feeling the weight of 1963 finally crushing the life he'd built from its ashes. Claire stood beside his reading chair, her fingers trailing across the worn leather armrest where he'd spent countless evenings avoiding the truth. In the lamplight, she looked younger than she had that afternoon, mid-40s perhaps, with the kind of polished competence that screamed federal training. Not FBI, though. Something newer. Something that hadn't existed when Bill still believed in the righteousness of government service. "You kept excellent records," she said without preamble. "The apartment upstairs is fascinating. 40 years of newspaper clippings, all carefully filed by date. November 22nd, 1963 has quite an extensive folder." Bill's hands clenched at his sides. His private archives, the documentation he'd never been able to throw away but had never dared examine, were supposed to be hidden behind a false wall that had taken him 3 years to construct. "Those are personal papers." "Personal?" Claire lifted a manila folder from the side table. "Transcripts of phone calls made from the White House Communications Office between 11:47 p.m. and 2:15 a.m. on November 22nd. Route modifications authorized under Deputy Chief of Staff William Hartley's signature. Orders to delay Secret Service briefings until after the motorcade departure." She opened the folder, scanning contents that made Bill's vision blur. "This reads less like personal memorabilia and more like insurance." The words hit him like physical blows. He'd kept those records as penance, proof of his complicity that he could never escape. But seeing them in Claire's hands transformed them into weapons, pointed at everything he'd tried to protect. "You don't understand what you're reading." "Don't I?" Claire's smile carried genuine warmth, which somehow made it more terrifying. I understand that you've spent 60 years believing you helped assassinate John F. Kennedy, living with the weight of thinking your route changes, your communication delays, your carefully orchestrated security lapses contributed to his death. My God, the guilt must have been extraordinary. Bill stared at her, confusion cutting through his fear. The recordings are incomplete. Claire pulled out a second folder, this one thick with official government seals. This is what we didn't show you in 1963, Mr. Hartley, the full scope of what happened that November day. Would you like to know what your actions actually accomplished? She opened the folder with theatrical precision, revealing photographs Bill had never seen. Crime scene images from Dallas, but not from Dealey Plaza. These were taken inside a warehouse 20 miles from the motorcade route, showing 3 bodies sprawled around sophisticated rifle equipment and radio gear. The real assassination team, Claire said quietly, eliminated at 12:17 p.m. Central Time, 17 minutes before the motorcade was scheduled to reach their kill zone. She turned the page, revealing more photographs. Maps with sniper positions marked, communications equipment powerful enough to coordinate a military-style operation. Your route changes didn't enable Kennedy's murder, Mr. Hartley. They prevented it. The reading chair behind Bill's knees caught him as he collapsed. 60 years of carefully constructed guilt crumbled in seconds, leaving him staring at evidence that rewrote his entire understanding of that terrible day. That's impossible, he whispered. Kennedy died in Dallas. Kennedy died because of Lee Harvey Oswald, a damaged young man with delusions of grandeur and a mail-order rifle. A tragic coincidence that occurred while we were busy preventing a far more sophisticated conspiracy. Claire knelt beside his chair, her voice taking on an almost gentle quality. You saved the president from a planned execution, Mr. Hartley. Unfortunately, you couldn't save him from random chance. Bill's mind reeled, trying to process the implications. If this was true, if his actions had prevented one assassination rather than enabling another, then everything he'd believed about himself was a lie. Every choice he'd made since 1963, every protective distance he'd maintained, every sacrifice he'd imposed on Sarah's childhood, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Why? The word came out broken. Why let me believe? Because guilt makes excellent control, Claire said simply. A man who believes he killed a president will do anything to prevent that truth from surfacing, will keep secrets, maintain distance from his family, avoid any action that might draw attention to his past. She stood, smoothing her jacket. You've been remarkably manageable for 60 years, Mr. Hartley. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just hidden the truth, they'd weaponized his guilt, used his grief as a leash to control him across 6 decades, made him complicit in his own imprisonment through carefully maintained ignorance. My daughter, he said, understanding flooding through him with terrible clarity. She's not investigating the assassination at all. Claire's smile finally showed its true nature. Sarah is investigating you. How long? His voice came out as a whisper. Claire consulted her phone with casual indifference. 3 months. She started with simple questions, background checks for a story about political families in Georgetown, she told her editor. But your daughter inherited your investigative instincts, Mr. Hartley. Once she began digging into William Bill Hartley, former White House Chief of Staff, the inconsistencies became fascinating. The bookstore's familiar wall seemed to press inward. Bill thought of every awkward family dinner, every birthday celebration cut short by his sudden need to retreat to work, every time Sarah had asked about his years in Washington only to be met with deflection. He'd thought he was protecting her. Instead, he'd been creating a mystery that would inevitably draw her brilliant, relentless mind. The financial records were particularly interesting, Claire continued, settling into the chair across from his. A man who earned a government salary until 1963, then somehow acquired enough capital to purchase prime Georgetown real estate and stock a rare book collection worth several $100,000. Your daughter is quite skilled at following money trails. Bill's hands trembled as the full scope of his exposure became clear. The bookstore, his apartment, his entire carefully constructed life, all of it purchased with what amounted to blood money. Payments made by the same shadow network that had controlled him through manufactured guilt. Compensation for services rendered in preventing one assassination while enabling another. She found the offshore accounts? Last Tuesday. Payments made quarterly for 40 years to something called Meridian Consulting Services. Quite generous compensation for a retired government employee who runs an antique bookstore. Claire's smile carried maternal pride, as if Sarah were her own protégée. She's scheduled to meet with a Treasury Department source tomorrow morning, someone who specializes in tracking unusual financial patterns from the Cold War era. The room spun around Bill as he understood the trap's final mechanism. Sarah's investigation would lead her to evidence of payments, then to questions about services rendered, then inevitably to classified records that would paint her father as either a willing conspirator or a carefully managed asset. Either revelation would destroy her career, her understanding of her own family, her faith in everything she'd believed about the man who'd raised her. "You're using her to get to me," Bill said, the words tasting like ash. "We're using you to protect her," Claire corrected. Sarah is 3 interviews away from discovering that her father has been receiving money from intelligence sources for 60 years. Imagine how that appears to a journalist trained to follow evidence wherever it leads. Imagine the story she'll write when she realizes the truth. Bill closed his eyes, seeing the inevitable headlines that would destroy his daughter's life. Veteran journalist discovers father's role in Kennedy assassination. The revelation would end Sarah's career, make her a target for every conspiracy theorist and government skeptic in the country. She'd spend the rest of her life defending or condemning choices she'd never understood, carrying weight that had already crushed one generation. "What do you want?" The question came out defeated, because he already knew the answer. Claire leaned forward, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to closing difficult negotiations. "Your daughter's treasury source is prepared to provide classified financial records that will connect you directly to the events of November 22nd, 1963. He believes he's helping expose corruption. We can redirect his enthusiasm toward more appropriate targets. In exchange for what? Your cooperation in finalizing an arrangement that should have been concluded decades ago. You have knowledge of operations, personnel, and decision-making processes that extend far beyond Dallas. That information needs to be properly documented and secured before it disappears with your generation." Bill understood the euphemism. They wanted a full debriefing, every detail of his involvement in preventing the original assassination attempt, every name of everyone who'd known about the warehouse team, every piece of evidence he'd hidden in his apartment archives. A complete betrayal of the few remaining principles that had sustained him through 60 years of controlled guilt. "And if I refuse?" Claire's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. Then Sarah meets her treasury source tomorrow morning and learns that her father has been a paid intelligence asset since 1963. She writes that story, destroys her own career in the process, and spends the rest of her life wondering whether the man who raised her was a patriot or a traitor. Outside, Georgetown settled into its evening rhythm, couples walking to dinner, students heading home from the university, normal people living normal lives, untouched by the machinery of secrets that had been grinding toward this moment for 6 decades. Bill looked at the photographs scattered on the table, evidence of the conspiracy he'd helped prevent and the larger conspiracy he'd unwittingly served. Then he thought of Sarah, brilliant and determined and completely unprepared for the moral quicksand about to swallow them both. The choice, like every choice since Dallas, was no choice at all. The word emerged from Bill Hartley with surprising clarity, cutting through the bookstore's suffocating atmosphere like a blade. Claire's confident expression flickered, just for an instant, as if she'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" Bill stood slowly, his legs steadier than they'd been in hours. 60 years of carefully controlled guilt had just collapsed, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten existed: righteous anger. "I said no more lies, no more manipulation, and no more using my daughter as leverage against me." Claire's composure slipped another degree. She'd orchestrated this confrontation expecting the same broken man who'd spent 6 decades accepting whatever story he'd been fed. Instead, she was facing someone who just discovered that his entire understanding of himself had been a carefully manufactured fiction. "Mr. Hartley, you're not thinking clearly. Sarah's investigation is based on questions I should have answered 30 years ago." Bill moved toward his desk, each step feeling more solid than the last. "You made one critical error, Claire. You assumed that guilt was my primary motivation, but it was never guilt that kept me quiet." He pulled open the desk's bottom drawer, revealing a hidden compartment Claire's search had somehow missed. Inside lay a single manila envelope, its edges worn from handling, but its contents pristine. Bill had opened it exactly once. the day after Sarah graduated college, then sealed it away until he found the courage to destroy it. It was love, he continued, withdrawing a thick sheaf of documents. Fear that the truth would put Sarah in danger, but you've just proven that keeping secrets is what's dangerous. Claire's hand moved subtly toward her jacket, a gesture Bill caught with the peripheral awareness of someone who'd spent years in rooms where violence lurked beneath diplomatic language. But he wasn't threatening her. He was threatening something far more valuable, the careful architecture of control that had kept him manageable for 6 decades. These are copies, Bill said, holding up the documents. Everything I witnessed in November 1963. Every name, every operation, every lie told to Congress and the Warren Commission. I've kept them for 60 years, waiting for the courage to decide what they meant. He set the papers on the table beside Claire's photographs, creating a collision between past and present that neither of them could control. You want documentation? Here it is. Every detail of how a shadow network prevented one assassination while enabling their own rise to power. How they created a mythology around Lee Harvey Oswald to hide the fact that they'd eliminated the real threat hours earlier. How they built an empire of secrets on the grave of a president. Claire's professional mask finally cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. You don't understand the larger picture. I understand that you've spent 60 years protecting yourselves, not the country. Bill's voice carried the authority of someone who'd finally stopped believing comfortable lies. I understand that Sarah isn't investigating me. She's investigating them. The same network that's been paying me hush money since 1963. The same network that's now terrified because a new generation of journalists doesn't respect their carefully constructed narratives. The truth hung between them like electricity before a storm. Claire had made a fundamental miscalculation in revealing that Bill's guilt was manufactured. She'd meant to demonstrate her organization's power, their ability to manipulate truth itself. Instead, she'd freed him from the only chain that had ever held him. Sarah already knows, doesn't she? Bill realized, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. She's been watching this bookstore, following the money, documenting the surveillance. That's why you're here tonight, not to prevent her investigation, but to manage its conclusion. Claire's silence confirmed everything. Bill laughed, a sound devoid of humor but rich with liberation. You waited too long, spent so many years believing I'd stay broken that you missed the moment when staying silent became more dangerous than speaking truth. He gathered both sets of documents, his movements deliberate and calm. Outside, Georgetown's evening rhythms continued. But inside the bookstore, 60 years of carefully maintained balance was shifting towards something unprecedented. Honesty. Here's what's going to happen, Bill said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd finally stopped being afraid. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling my daughter. Then I'm calling her editor. Then I'm calling every journalist in Washington who still believes their job is holding power accountable. Claire stood, her composure fragmenting as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. The consequences will be mine to bear, finally. Bill moved toward the bookstore's front door, documents in hand. You made me believe I was responsible for Kennedy's death. You kept me quiet by convincing me that silence protected the people I loved. But Sarah's investigation has already proven that silence protects no one except the powerful. He opened the door, feeling Georgetown's cool evening air wash away decades of accumulated shame. Behind him, Claire stood frozen in the ruins of a control strategy that had finally collapsed under its own contradictions. The truth, after 60 years, was finally ready to breathe. The morning newspapers lay spread across his desk like tarot cards revealing an uncertain future. Sarah's byline dominated the Washington Post's front page, the Kennedy Files, how a shadow network used false guilt to control a generation. The story had broken with the force of a dam burst, sending ripples through Georgetown's carefully maintained political ecosystem. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since publication. Reporters, historians, former colleagues from the Kennedy administration, all wanting confirmation, clarification, or simple human connection to events that had shaped their understanding of American power. Bill had answered each call with the same quiet honesty that had sustained him through Sarah's interview 3 nights ago. The interview. He'd expected anger, accusations. The justified fury of a daughter discovering 60 years of careful distance had been built on lies. Instead, Sarah had sat in the bookstore's reading corner, the same chair where Claire had tried to complete 6 decades of manipulation, and listened with the professional compassion that made her such an effective journalist. Why didn't you tell me, she'd asked. but not with the wounded tone he'd anticipated. Her voice carried something closer to grief, as if she were mourning not just his choices but the lost years when honesty might have brought them closer. "Because I believed their story," he'd answered. "Because guilt feels like responsibility, and responsibility feels like love. I thought keeping distance kept you safe." Now, watching Georgetown's morning foot traffic through the bookstore's windows, Bill understood that safety had been another illusion. Real safety came from truth shared between people who chose to trust each other despite the risks. The door chime announced a familiar presence. Sarah entered carrying coffee and something that might have been tentative hope. She'd been stopping by each morning since the story broke, not with interview questions but with the careful attention of someone rebuilding a relationship that had been stunted by decades of protective distance. "The Times wants to syndicate the series," she said, settling into the reading chair that had become their designated space for difficult conversations. 17 newspapers across the country. They're calling it the most significant intelligence story since Watergate. Bill nodded, feeling pride and apprehension in equal measure. His daughter had taken 60 years of carefully hidden truth and transformed it into something that might actually hold power accountable. But he also understood the machinery of retaliation that her courage had set in motion. "Any word from your editor about security measures?" Sarah's smile carried grim satisfaction. "Turns out Claire's organization made a critical error. They assumed journalists would be intimidated by threats to their careers. They didn't account for what happens when you threaten a journalist's family." She pulled out her laptop, showing him an email thread that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Colleagues from across the industry offering resources, legal support, security consultations. Sarah's investigation had revealed not just historical corruption, but contemporary surveillance evidence that the same network that had controlled Bill was actively monitoring current journalists, politicians, and activists. "It's bigger than Dallas," Sarah continued. "The payments, the manufactured guilt, the careful management of inconvenient witnesses, they've been running variations on the same operation for 60 years. Your story was just the test case." Bill absorbed this information with the strange calm that had settled over him since choosing honesty. He'd spent 6 decades believing he was uniquely damaged, uniquely complicit. Learning that his experience was part of a larger pattern felt both terrible and oddly comforting. Outside, Georgetown continued its eternal rhythm of academic ambition and political maneuvering, but inside the bookstore, father and daughter sat in the kind of comfortable silence that had been impossible when secrets lived between them. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we didn't have," Bill said finally. "All the times I pulled away because I thought distance meant protection." Sarah reached across the space between their chairs, her hand finding his with the careful hope of someone testing whether forgiveness was possible. "We're having them now." Her touch carried 60 years of questions finally receiving answers, 60 years of careful emotional distance finally closing. Bill understood that some damage couldn't be undone. Sarah's childhood, his own decades of isolation, the years when honesty might have made them allies rather than careful strangers. But he also understood that healing didn't require erasing the past. It required choosing truth over comfortable lies, connection over protective distance. The afternoon light slanted through the bookstore windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like secrets finally set free. Bill Hartley, former keeper of terrible knowledge, current seller of antique stories, sat with his daughter in the space where his long imprisonment had finally ended. The truth, after 60 years of careful silence, had found its voice.